morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a long trial, and we've all seen how attentive you've been for close to a month now, and my client and I greatly appreciate that. But we really are closing in on the end. Having said that, I'm going to call on your patience one last time today as I review the evidence. I do promise I won't take a moment longer than I feel is necessary, but this is my last chance to speak with you, and there are a number of extremely important things I need to say before you retire for your deliberations. Also, I apologize in advance if I review some of the things that Mr. LaRocca has discussed, but we are representing individual clients, and each of us has to cover everything that pertains to our clients, even if some of those things apply to both. First, it's worth mentioning that I'm at a disadvantage because when I'm done speaking with you, that's it, I'm done. This is my last chance. When I'm done, the prosecutor is going to get up and give her closing statement. And of course, I'll be sitting there wanting to refute what she's saying, but I can't do that. So, because of that, I'm going to try to anticipate some of her arguments. And I'm going to say to you that these are some of the things that the state is going to argue. And I'm going to give you my rebuttal, my contention how that is not true. Because I hope that you will use my arguments to refute what the prosecutor says when you go back to deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin by talking about something that is really quite remarkable. Something that distinguishes this case from virtually all other cases. As the lead investigator of this homicide, it's Detective Petruzzulo's responsibility to write a report detailing the entire investigation. He did write a report, and we all questioned him about it. You may recall that I asked him whether or not he had filed any subsequent reports or made any addendums to that report. He answered that he had not. In short, the investigation came to an end, and he submitted his report in which he indicated that the case was closed. There was no further action taken to find the killer. There was, as we will talk about later, an additional report about a month ago, 1 month ago, by Detective Castillo of the prosecutor's office. But that was not set forth as an addendum to Petruzzulo's final investigation report. But there's a big problem that emerges out of what we learned about those reports and this investigation from the witnesses. You may recall, ladies and gentlemen, that at the outset of this case, I told you that there were what I called, quote, glaring omissions, close quote, in the state's case. Those omissions are a result of the police prematurely closing the case and stopping the investigation. They are the result of the detective's failure to follow up on absolutely critical leads that might have actually led us to the true killer. And so, because they didn't do their jobs, it's left to you to fill in the gaps that they left, to fill in those glaring omissions. But that is, of course, impossible. Without the testimony of critical witnesses and without the benefit of a real investigation, it's simply impossible to get to the bottom of what happened. For example, you don't have the testimony of Nika Ricks. You don't have the testimony of Pronte White. And you don't have a great deal of other evidence that was right in their hands. Testimony from people they simply didn't pursue. They knew these were critical witnesses, and yet they never sought them out. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but it's really inconceivable that a trained team of detectives could simply do nothing to procure the testimony of people who could have solved this crime. Ladies and gentlemen, you also don't have anything that would tell you why this terrible murder occurred. In other words, there's no evidence of a motive. Now, motive does not have to be proven. There's no legal requirement that the prosecution provide you with a motive. But it'd be nice It certainly helps. In fact, it helps a great deal to have an idea why someone was killed if you really want to catch the killer. As we'll discuss later, the police had many opportunities to discover things about motive, but again, they simply failed to do so. They failed to do so because they didn't do their jobs. Unfortunately, that is a consistent pattern throughout this entire case. And I want you to know that I don't say that lightly. I don't particularly like attacking police officers, although people think I do. Like everyone else, I want our police officers to be trustworthy and to do their jobs thoroughly and in a way that inspires our confidence. But as we know, that's not always the case, and we know for sure it certainly was not the case here. And as a result, this failed investigation has led us to a point where we simply don't know who killed Cosmic Gee. We only know that it wasn't my client. The prosecution has not only failed to produce evidence that meets the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, but it hasn't provided you with any evidence whatsoever that would show that my client was even in the car that night and that he killed the victim. So let's talk about what evidence they did produce. In doing that, let's address the one question that stands above all others in this trial. What evidence have they produced to show that my client, or even the co-defendant, was ever in that car? What proof is there that Jossie Allen ever stepped foot inside the car? This is critical, ladies and gentlemen, because if there's no proof that either of these men were ever inside the car that the prosecution tells you was the car used in the murder, let's call it the murder car, and I'm talking about the 2012 Audi 6, then the prosecution has absolutely no case. So let's go along with them for a moment. Let's assume that the car in the 7th Ave video, the 2012 Audi 6, was actually the murder car. We don't know that for a fact, but it's a possibility. So let's talk about the car. What do we know for sure about the Audi? Well, first we know that it belonged to a man named Timothy Collins. It was stolen from Mr. Collins out of Summit Township on September 16, 2016. We also know that Detective Flora, we also know from Detective Flora that it was located 3 days later on September 19, 2016 by the State Police Auto Theft Task Force. And we know that on the day they found it, and curiously, without even telling the owner that they had found his car, detectives from the Auto Theft Task Force placed a GPS tracking device on the car in order to follow it wherever it went. The device remained on the car for at least the next 11 days until the murder took place on September 30th, 2016. Now, from the moment the GPS device was placed on the car, the authorities had the ability to track the movements of that Audi wherever it went. In fact, the prosecution presented evidence at this trial of the movements of the car on the night of the homicide. And Detective Petrozzullo testified that utilizing the movements of the car based on this GPS tracking device, the police were then able to go through the city of Patterson and find a remarkable number of cameras that showed the car either in motion or stationary at various locations and for various lengths of time throughout the evening. And although it may have some disturbing implications for our privacy rights, it really is tremendous technology, ladies and gentlemen. We've advanced to the point where we can trace the movements of a car, and then based what is learned from that tracking, we can go out and find video cameras all over the city that are able to actually see the very car at the moment it's being tracked. In some ways, it's as if we've got a window into the past. And putting aside privacy concerns, we can all agree that when used properly, the combination of GPS and video cameras is an extremely effective tool for investigating crimes. And none of this would have been possible just a few years ago. But today, cameras are virtually everywhere, and GPS tracking has become so commonplace that it exists on everyone's smartphone. And yet, with all this truly remarkable technology, and with all of the enormous power of the state available to utilize it in an effort to solve this terrible crime, in the end, it did absolutely nothing to illuminate the truth about who was really in that car. It's not the fault of technology. It's simply the poor manner in which it was used. Think about it, ladies and gentlemen. There was not a single time, not one time, that we actually saw anyone enter that car. Not once. And far more important for our purposes, there was not a single time that we saw my client or even the co-defendant entering the car. All of this extraordinary technology has resulted in absolutely no insight into who went inside that car. Is that for a lack of opportunity? Is the technology that the state so proudly presents to you limited in some way that it made it impossible to connect my client with the car? Nothing could be farther from the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that the GPS device was placed on the car on September 19th. It stayed there the entire time up to the killing on September 30th. We know from the testimony that for most of that time, the car was in the city of Patterson. But wherever the car was, there were roughly 11 days that the police had access to information detailing the whereabouts of that car. Why is that so important? Well, the prosecution is going to argue to you that on the night of the murder, the defendants were in possession of the Audi. Of course they have to argue that, because it's their position that the Audi was the murder car. So if you wanted to prove that the car was in possession of either defendant, how would you do it? Well, first, let's use the same technique, the very same technique the investigators used on the night of the murder. Let's find out where the car was parked during those 11 days, and then go back and look for video cameras from whatever area it was parked in, and see who got in and who got out. How hard would that be? Well, they came up with dozens of video cameras from the night of the murder. Wouldn't it be reasonable to expect that there might be many more videos showing the car during those 11 days they were tracking it in Patterson, or wherever it was? And wouldn't those videos be extremely helpful in telling us who had access to the car? Let's use an example. The car had to be somewhere the night before the murder. The police claimed to know where it was because, as we learned, they had this GPS tracking device telling them exactly where it was. So wouldn't it be logical to go out and collect surveillance cameras from whatever location the car was stopped? If Jossie Allen or Jamal Wade were ever inside that car, one way to prove it would be to find a camera that clearly, and I stress the word clearly, shows either of them entering the car. It doesn't really matter if it was from earlier on the murder day, or the day before the murder, or the day before that, or even 10 days before that. If you want to know if my client was ever in that car, then go look for the evidence that would prove it. But they don't. Ladies and gentlemen, they don't look for it because it is a shoddy investigation. This is an investigation where the most basic steps necessary to discover the truth are simply not taken. And not because they were unavailable, but rather the police simply didn't do it. They just didn't do their job. It's absolutely critical to know if there is any connection whatsoever between my client and the car that presumably is the murder car. They had the means to find that out, and yet they did nothing. One last thing about the car, ladies and gentlemen. If you recall, when it was stolen from Timothy Collins in Summit, it did not have tinted windows. But then, when it was seized on September 30th, it did have tinted windows. Now, what effort did the police make to see who tinted the windows? We know that the car was parked for an extended period of time right next to Oliver's Auto Garage. Did the police ever go there and see if Oliver's did the tinting or any other maintenance on the car? Did they check to see if there were any surveillance videos at Oliver's so they might have seen anyone going in and out of the car? We know the answer to those questions. They not only didn't check Oliver's, they didn't check anywhere, even though they knew where the car was located throughout those 11 days. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to believe my client was inside the alley. They present absolutely no proof of it, but they want you to believe it. In fact, there's not one single piece of evidence in this case to show that either my client or the co-defendant were ever inside that car. Had the police continued to search for surveillance cameras showing the people getting in and out of the car during the 11 days they were tracking it, and especially during the time it was in Patterson, we might have an identification. We might actually know who the killer was. But we don't, despite the fact that the ability to find those cameras 2 years ago was there. But now the possibility of identifying anyone connected to that car is simply gone. But ladies and gentlemen, those surveillance cameras were not the only means to identify the killer. In fact, we learned in this trial that there actually was an eyewitness to the murder. Let me say that again. There was an eyewitness to the murder. Her name was Kika Ricks, and as Detective Petrozzullo says in his report, she was related to the victim, or to use the detective's words, she was a family member. And this witness was located by the police almost immediately after the murder. In fact, she was in the house with the victim and the victim's aunt, Darlene Gee, moments before the shooting. Perhaps you recall my cross-examination of Detective Petrozzullo when I asked him about his conversation with Nika Ricks on the night of the murder, and I read it from his report. It said, and I'm quoting, quote, "According to Miss Ricks, the shooter was not wearing a mask. However, she did not recognize his face as someone she knew. Miss Ricks said she witnessed the male fire several shots into Cosme's vehicle at close range. She said she could see the muzzle flash as the handgun was being fired. Miss Ricks said the suspect then entered the dark-colored vehicle and it sped away on 12th Avenue, close quote." During my cross-examination, Detective Petrozzullo confirmed that this was exactly what he wrote in his report. So let's examine this carefully, ladies and gentlemen. First, we know that someone actually watched the murder take place. That person had a clear and unobstructed view of the killer. Further, and most important, she was able to see the shooter. The first thing she said was that the shooter was not wearing a mask. Ladies and gentlemen, she wouldn't know that if she couldn't see him clearly. It's obvious that she did see him. But more important, according to Petrozzullo, she then said, and I'm quoting, quote, "She did not recognize his face as someone she knew," close quote. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. This woman had a good enough view to know that she didn't recognize the face of the killer. What does that tell us? It tells us that she is able to recognize the killer's face. She can recognize the killer's face. She doesn't know whose face it is, but she can recognize it. It's just not someone she knows, but she's clearly capable of recognizing him. So what should the police do? Well, this should be absolutely routine stuff, ladies and gentlemen. If I'm walking down the street and I see a guy with a gun running out of a bank after a bank robbery, and I tell the police that I didn't recognize the guy, what's going to happen next? Let's use our common sense. The police are going to assume it's not anyone I know because I can't recognize him. But are they going to let me just walk away? Of course not. They're going to show me photographs of other people to find out if I see the bank robber among the photos. And then if they have a suspect, they will show me a photo or a photo lineup to see if I can pick out the bank robber. That's just basic investigative work, ladies and gentlemen. There is nothing more routine than showing a photo array to a witness if the witness got a good look at the suspect. It happens thousands of times a day in police stations all over the country. And it's especially critical when the witness can already say that they didn't recognize the person. The fact that she didn't recognize him is the very same thing as saying she's able to recognize him. No one can say it's not someone I recognize unless they would be able to recognize him. If they were unable to recognize him, then they would say so. They would say, I didn't get a good look at his face, or it all happened so fast, I really couldn't tell anything. Is that what she said, ladies and gentlemen? Absolutely not. She tells Petrozzullo that the killer was not someone she recognizes. Okay, that's fine. So what's the next step? Show her photos of other people. And since there are two men on trial here, show her photos of Jossie Allen or Jamal Wade. Do they do that? No, they don't. Why not? Why don't they do that? Well, listen to the answer that I brought out from Detective Petrozzullo's report. Nika Ricks did not wish to respond to the Detective Bureau with us to provide a formal statement for fear of retaliation. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. Nika Ricks did not wish to respond to the Detective Bureau with us to provide a formal statement for fear of retaliation. And that's it. An eyewitness to a murder is afraid, and so they let her just vanish into the mist. Ladies and gentlemen, use your common sense. How many times a day do you think the police hear that? Everyone is at least a little afraid. No one really wants to get involved, but do the police just leave it at that? Do they just walk away once someone tells them that? Okay, you're afraid, so just forget about it. It's a murder, it doesn't matter. Does that sound like good police work to you? Of course not. They should have spent hours, days, weeks, months, even years if necessary, convincing that witness to come to the police station and make a photo identification. They have the golden nugget of this investigation, an eyewitness who can identify the killer. You don't just let that slip away because she initially expresses a fear of being involved. There are ways around her fear. Even if it's just to be sure she feels safe, promise that you won't reveal her identity. She can make an anonymous identification. That happens all the time. If she doesn't want to go to the police station, bring the photographs to her. And most important, don't stop. Don't stop. Don't quit. You have an eyewitness. You can't just walk away from her. That's crazy, ladies and gentlemen. And yet that's exactly what they did in this case. Nika Ricks is never again mentioned in Detective Petrozzullo's report. There was absolutely no effort made to seek her cooperation again in this case. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not just an inferior, second-rate, and lazy investigation. That is an outrage. That is an assault on our senses. Police, and especially detectives, are trained to elicit information. How do you just walk away from an eyewitness who essentially tells you, I can identify the killer? There is one possible reason. Maybe the police were afraid that Nika Ricks would look at a photo array that includes my client and say, he's not here. Or if shown a single photo, she might say, that's not the guy. After all, if the one person who actually saw the killer says that the killer is not my client, then what happens to their entire case? It's over. It's over, and their abysmal attempt to conduct a real investigation is eviscerated. Are they afraid of the truth? You're damn right they are. And their own cowardice has led to the wrongful prosecution of my client. Is that the motive for their inexplicable failure to conduct any follow-up on the one person who is by far the most important witness they have in the case? We will never know, ladies and gentlemen. But we do know that Nika Ricks might have been able to tell us who the killer was, and the police didn't even find out where she lives or her telephone number. They didn't even get her basic pedigree information, her birth date, identification, anything. We don't even know how old she is. Instead, Detective Petrozzullo just watched as his most important witness simply walked away. That's not police work, ladies and gentlemen, and the sad thing is that these failures of investigation are everywhere in this case. Still, despite this incredibly flawed investigation, the prosecution will argue to you that they have the evidence. They will point to the video allegedly showing the killers exiting the car around 11:52 p.m. on 7th Ave near East 16th Street shortly after the murder. In fact, it's fair to say that the prosecution's entire case is dependent on this single surveillance. And yet the video cameras, first on 7th Ave and then on 16th Street, as we will discuss in detail, prove the exact opposite of what they say it proves. The prosecution will claim that the video taken after the murder, in which you can see the car driving down 7th Avenue, parking, and then two men getting out, is sufficient evidence that the two defendants were in the car. That's not true, ladies and gentlemen. It's absurd. To put it concisely as possible, their whole case against my client is based on two false claims. First, that the man in the black jacket at the 350 liquor store on 10th Ave is my client, and that the man you see in the dark of night getting out of the passenger seat of the Audi and walking up 7th Ave and then down East 16th Street is the very same individual. The man in the black jacket you see earlier at 350 liquor store. That's their case, ladies and gentlemen. The man in the black jacket, who they falsely claim is my client, is the very same man who was seen leaving the Audi. But both assertions are belied by the evidence. Both assertions are simply not true. So ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about those two videos. And let's start with the question of whether the man exiting the car at 350 liquor store on 10th Ave is my client. From the first set of surveillance videos, it's clear that a Honda Accord pulled up outside the liquor store around 10:46 p.m. After a few moments, a man with a black jacket comes out of the passenger side of the Honda and mingles with the people outside the liquor store. He is wearing a very distinctive black jacket. The black jacket is over a white sweatshirt with a white hoodie. He stands out, ladies and gentlemen, because of the jacket. It is dark black, and it contrasts dramatically with his white hoodie and white pants. This is the man they say is my client, but it's not true. When you look carefully at the video, you'll see that it's difficult to get a good look at the person's face. You'd probably have to know the person to tell who he is. So what do we get, ladies and gentlemen? We get a stipulation read to you from a guy named Jason English, who claims he recognizes him as my client. We don't know anything about English other than the fact that he didn't testify. We do know that if he did testify, he would say that the guy in the black jacket is Jossie Allen. But we don't get a chance to assess his credibility. We don't get to cross-examine him. We have no opportunity to ask him how he could possibly make that kind of identification. We only know that if he were to come to court, he would say, it's him. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not the kind of evidence that you can rely on to make a judgment in something as serious as a murder trial. This is a critical identification. It's critical because the prosecution is going to argue that the man with the black jacket outside the liquor store is the same guy who got out of the Audi on 7th Ave, an hour later after the murder. But ladies and gentlemen, as with so many things in this case, there was another way to find out the truth about the identity of that individual in the black jacket. Unfortunately, the police never followed up on it. but there was one person who knew him and recognized him. Again, it's important to stress that this was a witness who didn't just recognize him, but actually knew him. There's a huge difference between being able to recognize someone you've never seen before and identifying someone you actually know. And this person was not even located by the investigators until nearly 2 years. 2 years after the murder. In fact, it was just a few weeks before the trial began. Who is she? Well, she's the owner of the Honda Accord. She's the owner of the car, ladies and gentlemen, that the supposed killer got out of just an hour before the murder. Her name is Pronte White, and it was her car. How could the detectives not have found her? Were they even looking for her? They knew the registration of the car from looking at the video, so they knew it right from the start of the investigation, or at least sometime thereafter. So why didn't they go looking for her? That car is a central part of the investigation, and she was the owner. All they had to do was look up the registration, and yet we don't even hear about her until 2 years after the homicide. Ladies and gentlemen, that's simply inexcusable, but it's also consistent with the shameful and incompetent way in which this case was investigated right from the beginning. Well, we found out from Detective Castillo that they finally interviewed her just a couple weeks ago. They showed her the video and she immediately recognized the car as hers. In fact, Detective Castillo confirmed the fact that the car belonged to her. So simply put, a Honda Accord pulled up to 350 liquor stores on 10th Ave an hour before the murder. We see that on the tape. A man with a black jacket emerged from the passenger side of the car. The prosecution's entire case, and I mean their entire case, is based on their mistaken belief that the man who emerged out of the passenger side of the car at the liquor store is the killer. The car he got out of belonged to Pronte White. They had the license plate number on that car, yet they never went looking for her. Why not? Why didn't they move heaven and earth to find that woman and ask her who was in her car that night? There's just no good answer to that, ladies and gentlemen. It took them 2 full years to finally seek her out. In fact, it's obvious they waited until the very eve of trial. How is that even possible? How could they have overlooked such a critical lead? There's simply no reasonable answer to that question. Now, we know, ladies and gentlemen, from my cross-examination of Detective Castillo, that when Miss White finally looked at the video from the liquor store and saw the man getting out of the car, she told the police she recognized him. She said he was the brother of an individual she used to hang out with. Her exact words were something to the effect of the brother of someone she used to deal with or be with. So we now know that 2 years after the murder, the woman who owned the car that allegedly carried the killer to the liquor store suddenly is found, brought to the prosecutor's office, and identifies the man emerging from the car with the black jacket as someone she recognizes as the brother of someone she used to hang out with. So who's the brother, ladies and gentlemen? If we knew who the brother was, then we would certainly have a very good idea who the passenger was. What we see here is a pattern of inexplicable investigative blunders that seem designed to keep us from the truth. Think about it. They now finally have the woman. She's at the prosecutor's office giving a statement telling them she recognizes the man in the blue jacket. Since she recognizes him, they ask her if she can look at photographs and pick them out. And she tells them that she can. So now finally we're going to find out who the guy is who got out of that car. But of course, nothing is ever simple in this investigation. Rather than make that photographic identification, Miss White, who had wasted a considerable amount of time alone in a room at the prosecutor's office, tells them she has to pick up her child at school. So she leaves with a promise to return the next day and make that identification. So what happens? Well, the following day, Detective Castillo gets a text message on his phone from Miss White, who tells him she will not be coming. Why? Because she already has given a statement. And that's it. That's the end of it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please think hard about this. They finally have a witness who can definitely identify the person who gets out of the passenger seat of the Honda and is wearing the black jacket, and who they claim is the murderer. And yet they let her walk out of the office without making an identification. But it seems likely she lives in town and she has a child somewhere nearby in school. The police also have her information, including her phone number, from which she texted the detective. And she's promised to come back the next day. But then she gets a little cold feet, nothing unusual. As we've noted before, nobody really wants to get involved if they don't have to. So what do you do if you're an investigator? Well, I think we all know the answer to that. You go and you find her. You get her. You talk to her. You try to convince her of the importance of her making an identification. After all, that's what detectives do for a living. That's what they've always done. That's what we taxpayers pay them to do. And there are a million techniques for doing it. But is that what happens here? Do they do their jobs? No, of course not. In fact, Detective Castillo's report ends right there. After that text, there was simply no further attempt to bring back the one person who could definitely tell us who it was that got out of that car and who was wearing the black jacket. It's just another instance of investigative malpractice. Ladies and gentlemen, as I've said, the prosecution's entire case is based on the idea that my client is the gentleman in the black jacket who is recognized by Miss White. Without Miss White's identification, we are left to our own devices. We are left to try to figure out for ourselves who that person is. But of course, that's impossible. There's no way on earth to look at that man and say definitely that he's my client. But the one person who could have told us who it was never pursued by the prosecutor's office or by the Patterson police, even though she agreed to look at photographs. Or is it impossible? One thing we know is that the man in the black jacket was at the 350 liquor store on the evening of the murder. We also know that there are lots of people hanging around there. If you want to claim that the man with the black jacket is Jossie Allen, then what would you do? Wouldn't you go back to the liquor store and talk to those people and ask if they know Jossie Allen? Was he there the night before? Why not ask the owners or the people who work there in the store if he was there? Somebody must have seen him. Somebody must know if he were there that night. Do they do that, ladies and gentlemen? Do they go speak to the people at the liquor store and ask about Jossie Allen? No, of course not. But how is that even possible? Nothing could be more basic. There are at least 20 people walking around the liquor store that night, and the police never bothered to go and talk to any of them. That kind of negligence in a murder case is really nothing short of disgraceful. It's an abomination. It's the type of lazy and ignorant approach that some police officers implement when they believe that anything they do, no matter how incompetent, is enough to convict a young man of the most serious charge we have in our entire criminal justice system. In any event, ladies and gentlemen, we don't know who that man is. We certainly know, however, that it's not my client. In fact, there's not a shred of credible evidence in this case suggesting that it's my client. The only thing we've heard was a stipulation by an unknown individual who you never saw named English who says it's him. There was no cross-examination of English. The idea that this man is the sole basis of the state's claim that the man in the black coat is my client is truly absurd. The truth is that the only witness who would know for sure Pronte White, the owner of the car he got out of, was allowed to just walk away. And there was no effort to bring her back. Nothing at all. Nothing whatsoever. And all of the people circulating around the liquor store on the night of the murder, not a single one was questioned by the police. This failure to investigate is nothing short of astonishing. Despite all of this, ladies and gentlemen, since it's the prosecutor's contention that the man in the black jacket is my client, let's just assume, only for purposes of this argument, that it's true. It's not true, but just let's assume it's true for a moment. And so let's address the second critical question as to whether the man in the black jacket at the liquor store is the same man who got out of the car an hour later on 7th Avenue after the killing. To do that, you'll have to closely look at the crucial set of videos in which you see two men exiting the Audi and then walking along with their heads down, first on 7th Ave and then on East 16th Street. One thing is clear from the tape, ladies and gentlemen. It's simply impossible to identify them. It's impossible to clearly and reliably identify them. No one looking at that tape could say who those people are. It's impossible. So what does the prosecution do in order to try to convince you that they know who these people are? They point you back to the video at the liquor store, and they try to convince you that Mr. Wade, who can be clearly seen in the videos at the liquor store, somehow resembles the person who gets out of the driver's seat when the car parks after the murder. He's wearing a gray hoodie and gray sweatpants, as do thousands of young men in the city of Patterson, including many you saw in the video outside the liquor store. Then they say that my client was the man in the black jacket, also at 350 liquor store, and that he resembles the second man getting out of the car. To prove that, the prosecution wants you to believe that the man who gets out of the passenger side of the car that's parked after the murder is wearing the same clothing as the individual they claim is my client back at the liquor store. But it's obviously not true. In fact, it's so obviously not true that the prosecution tries to get around the glaring differences in those clothes by blaming it on something Petrozzullo called, quote, night vision, close quote. As I mentioned before, the man who got out of the Honda Accord at 350 liquor store had a very distinctive black jacket. If you recall, when the prosecution questioned Detective Petrozzullo, she asked him why the jacket on the person at the liquor store was pitch black, and yet the jacket worn by the person walking away from the Audi was light gray. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact that she asked a question, the very fact that the prosecutor asked her lead detective that very question, shows how clear the distinction is. And it is clear. In fact, it's absolutely obvious when you look at the tapes. So what does Petrozzullo say to get around this obvious inconsistency? He says the difference in the color of the jacket is due to a distortion caused by what he calls night vision. Of course, he doesn't elaborate on what that means or why it existed in one place and not another, or why it would affect the color of the jacket. But that's all they have. That's all they got. So they go with it. But is that explanation even remotely true? Does the lighting really change the color? The answer becomes obvious when you look carefully at the video. So let's walk through it. When you go back to deliberate, ladies and gentlemen, look carefully at the video from 7th Ave. You will see that after the car pulls up and parks, the first individual exits the driver's side of the alley. A moment later, someone exits the passenger side. Now, it's at that point that the detective claims the passenger wipes down the car, presumably to avoid leaving fingerprints. Let me say this again so we're clear. I want you to look very carefully at the video, because Detective Petrozzullo testified under oath in front of you that the passenger got out and wiped down the car. My ears may not be pretty, but they work. I can hear. And I heard him say, and I know you heard him say, He said to you in open court, the passenger got out and wiped down the car. Beautiful. Do me a favor. Watch it for yourself. The video's there. It speaks for itself. You watch that video, and you come back, and you tell this prosecutor whether her detective is an outright liar or not. You will not see that. So, you can look at that tape 50 times, and you'll never see anybody wiping anything down. He makes it up. He also said that the man was wearing sunglasses. I said sunglasses is what he said. And again, ladies and gentlemen, just look at the video. If you watch it 100 times, you won't see any sunglasses. After a while, you start wondering if Petrozzullo is just imagining things, seeing things that just aren't there, just because it's easier than actually finding real evidence. It's easier to make things up than to do his job the right way. Anyway, the driver then begins walking across the street. He heads up 7th Avenue towards the corner of 16th Street. The passenger follows him a few feet behind. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is important. If you look closely, you will see that there are 3 black cars on the street. The first is the murder car, the Audi. You can see that it's black when it first drives by in the direction of the location where it will end up parking. Then as the man exits and starts to walk, you'll see there is another car across the street that is also black. Further, you will see that there is a black car that the driver walks past as he's heading towards the corner. 3 black cars. The passenger, of course, is following. He gets as far as the back of that black car before the camera shifts to 16th Street. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's clear as a bell that all of those cars are dark black. You'll see it for yourself. 3 cars, dark black. So if this so-called night vision is responsible for magically turning a black jacket into a light gray jacket, then why isn't it also turning 3 black cars gray? It's distinguishing between cars and jackets. It doesn't change their color just because that whole theory is nonsense. The detective simply makes up this nonsense about night vision in a desperate attempt to alter reality. According to him, what we clearly see as a light gray jacket is actually a black jacket. It's preposterous. But there's more. In fact, if you follow these 2 individuals after they turn onto 16th Street, in the next camera, there's something else that becomes obvious. The second individual, the passenger, has a shirt, perhaps a t-shirt underneath the hoodie, which he's wearing beneath the jacket. The shirt is not all that obvious from the front, but from the back you can see it clearly around the area of his waist. And what you see, clear as a bell, is that the shirt is dark black. Look for it. Around his waist, in the back, there's a shirt that's kind of sticking out. It's dark black. It's black the same way the cars parked on the street are dark black. The same way that the jacket worn by the individual they claimed to be my client back at 350 Liquor Store was also dark black. The bottom of the shirt that can be seen coming out underneath the hoodie, just like the cars, was somehow unaffected by the so-called night vision. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to look carefully at the individual at the liquor store who is wearing the black jacket and examine that black jacket so you'll see just how pitch black it really is. There's simply no way that something as dark as that would be undetected by the cameras and show possible perpetrators leaving the car after it's been parked on 7th Ave. The cameras detected the color black on the cars and on the shirt, so there's no reason in the world it would not have detected something as distinctively dark black as the jacket we see on the man at 350 Liquors. So ladies and gentlemen, there's no way the guy with the black jacket at the liquor store, whoever he is the same guy who got out of the 2012 Audi after the murder. So even if someone were to think that it was my client at the liquor store in the black jacket, it's absolutely clear that he can't be the murderer. Ladies and gentlemen, so far, we don't have a shred of evidence to connect my client or even the co-defendant to that car. So we have to ask if there was any forensic evidence found that might show connection. We all know how important forensic evidence is. There's an old expression, every contact leaves a trace. Every contact leaves a trace. And forensic science is so important, not only because it is so advanced in modern times, but also because over many years, we've learned about the unreliability of other kinds of evidence, including eyewitness testimony. So, a very crucial question we turn to in any case is, what are the forensic? And the answer here is none. Absolutely none. Not a single shred of forensic evidence that point at my client, Jossie Allen, or to the co-defendant. First, they never found the gun that killed the victim. Thus, there's nothing that can be used to link my client to the gun. They found shell casings on the street, but there's nothing to compare them to. And they were not examined for fingerprints. They found bullets in the victim's car, but again, that's nothing of use found on them. Now, did they carefully examine the 2012 Audi, the murder car? They went through the entire interior of the car, and they found no fingerprints of either defendant anywhere in the car. They found no DNA evidence left behind by either defendant. No hair was found by either defendant. No fiber from any clothing they might have worn was found. If every contact leaves a trace, then it certainly seems as though neither of these two defendants had ever been in that car. One interesting item found in that car was a pair of sandals. A pair of sandals. Now, that could be useful if the detectives took note of their size and compared their size to the shoe size of either defendant. Did the detectives do that? No. Of course not. Just another piece of potentially valuable evidence ignored. And what about the phone records, ladies and gentlemen? The prosecution brought an FBI agent to testify that they had Jamal Wade's phone records. Now, if these two men were planning a murder, wouldn't you think they would have spoken with each other at least once on the phone? Wouldn't you expect to see a phone call from Wade to Allen or Allen to Wade either before or after the murder? But there was no such testimony from anyone in this case. In fact, the prosecution presented no record of any single communication whatsoever between these two men at any time. Ladies and gentlemen, that's inconceivable. You're planning a murder with someone. You go and commit a murder with someone. You never call? You never text them? I mean, really? It doesn't make sense. I'm not talking about the contents of any calls. I'm just talking about the fact that no such calls were ever made. That kind of thing you see every month on your phone bills when your calling record is detailed, including the time of the call and the length of the call. The prosecution wants us to believe that these two men planned a murder, committed a murder, and never once communicated with each other either before or after the murder. There's no evidence for that. And the reason there's no evidence for that is that these two men did not commit the murder. And did you also notice, ladies and gentlemen, there was no mention of a search warrant of my client's residence? Why not? The police claimed they couldn't confirm his address. What kind of nonsense is that? They couldn't confirm his address. He's a suspect in a murder. Did they really expect us to believe that they couldn't find his address? Wouldn't that be critical in this investigation? Wouldn't you want to search his residence to see if there's anything there that might connect him to the car or even the murder itself? That's basic police work, but they didn't do it. Why not? Why did they do it? I don't know. I can only say that this is not just part of a pattern of mistakes. It's a pattern of indifference, a pattern of unconcern, a pattern of disinterest, a pattern of sheer and utter laziness, a pattern of arrogance and complacency, a failure to undertake fundamental and routine investigative actions. In sum, ladies and gentlemen, they found no forensic evidence whatsoever that points to either defendant. No fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers, no hairs, absolutely nothing. So what kind of investigation do we have, ladies and gentlemen? All the crucial eyewitnesses are simply ignored. The police never even go back to the scene to further canvass the area and see if there was anyone else who, like Nika Ricks, might have seen something that night. They make no effort to look for further surveillance tapes from the 11 days prior to the murder to see if either defendant ever entered that car. They never talked to anyone at 350 liquor store. They never even searched the place my client lived. And finally, they have no forensic evidence of any kind. In short, there's nothing. And yet, there is often a way of getting at the truth if you can figure out why the victim was killed. In other words, what was the motive? I mentioned before that the prosecution has not established any evidence of motive. And to be perfectly fair, they don't have to. They don't have to give you a motive. Motive is not an element of the crime. But it'd be nice to know. One of the first things you look for when investigating a case is motive. Cosmic Gee was killed for some reason. Someone wanted him dead. There are endless types of motives: jealousy, hatred, greed, and many more. But when we look at this investigation, it almost seems as though the police were indifferent to why the man was killed. There doesn't seem to have been any attempt at all to find out what the motive was. Remarkably, Detective Petrozzullo practically admitted that. He practically told us that. Remember when he testified that he never tried to learn about the victim's life? Ladies and gentlemen, how in the world do you find a motive that might lead you to the killer if you don't learn about the victim's life? It's ridiculous. It's one of the most important things to find out. Maybe the victim wasn't dead. Maybe the victim had an affair with someone's wife or husband. Maybe the victim had enemies of some kind. These are things you want to know. But it doesn't seem like the police had any interest in learning that type of information. There were a few things about the victim we learned almost by accident. We found out that he had been shot around 4 years before he was killed. We learned that he had been hit over the head with a bar stool a couple years after being shot. We also found out that he had some kind of altercation with a number of Hispanic males on the street shortly before his murder. Remember Detective Maldonado saying that he spoke with the victim's girlfriend about this. And yet he doesn't know who the girlfriend is. He doesn't know when he spoke with her. He doesn't know where he spoke with her. He doesn't even know her name. He doesn't even know where she lives. And most remarkable of all, he didn't even take any notes. He didn't memorialize this in any notes or bother to write a report. That's amazing. A detective talks to a murder victim's girlfriend and doesn't bother to take any notes? You can't even make that up. Only in Patterson. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, don't you think that this information would bear some further investigating? Is there any evidence the police tried to find out about who was involved in that recent altercation? The fact is there isn't. And what about the autopsy photos? The victim had tattoos all over his body. Were these innocent tattoos that millions of good people have, or were they gang tattoos? We don't know. And we don't know because the police never looked into it. And wouldn't it be important to know? Was this some kind of gang murder or retaliation? Without knowing more about the victim, we just don't know. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring all this up because it points to one constant in this case. which is the failure of the police to properly investigate this case. This was a lazy investigation. In fact, we actually saw a little bit of that indifference, that laziness. We saw the indifference to this case on display in this very courtroom. Remember Detective Petrozzullo texting with his phone while on the witness stand? He admitted he was checking his Facebook page, emails, and texts. This guy is up here on the witness stand during a murder trial in which he is the lead investigator, and he's browsing his social media? Apparently, this just isn't important enough for him to stay focused on. Yet another display of his complete apathy towards doing a job the right way. And is that really all that much of a surprise, considering the shamefully lackluster effort he put into this investigation? The truth is he had his videos and the GPS, and he figured that was good enough. Ladies and gentlemen, you remember how I said earlier how remarkable the new technology was, how it can be useful in solving some crimes, but we know there's a downside as well. Excessive reliance on technology can make people lazy. It can cause investigators to ignore the old-fashioned hard work it takes to put a case together. No technology in the world will ever replace good, hard police work. But unfortunately, that's not what we got here. We didn't get good, hard police work, and everyone suffers as a result. The defendants, the victim, and even you, because it leaves you with an unnecessary burden. You have to decide this case without the kind of evidence that you can rely on. Unfortunately, one way people make decisions without adequate evidence is by speculating. But there's a danger in that. There's a tremendous danger in speculating about what happened in a criminal case. That's the reason every lawful verdict must be based on facts and not on speculation. And when I say speculation, what do I mean? Well, if you look in one dictionary, they gave an example of its use in a sentence that I thought captured it simply and perfectly. The sentence was, the report was based on speculation rather than facts. Turn from a report to a criminal trial, and we can say we do not want a verdict that was based on speculation rather than facts. Yet sometimes in the absence of facts, it's easy to imagine something happening, or it's tempting to think it would have happened a certain way, or it might have happened in a certain way. But that kind of thinking is nothing more than mere speculation, and we should never, ever indulge in it or let it take the place of hard, cold facts. What evidence does the state have against Mr. Allen, ladies and gentlemen? They have some evidence against the car. They have some evidence against the 2012 Audi. But what do they have against my client? A murky video showing two men who cannot be identified leaving the Audi? That's pretty much it. Ladies and gentlemen, when you're back in the jury room deliberating, I would like you to ask yourselves a simple question. What other decision in life would you make and feel confident in based upon the degree of trustworthiness of the evidence we've heard in this courtroom? Would you make any decision at all based upon this kind of evidence? Would you buy a used car based on the trustworthiness of the state's evidence? Would you put a mortgage down on a house based on this kind of evidence? I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that you would not make any important decision whatsoever based on the kind of evidence we've heard in this case. How could you? What kind of confidence could anybody have in the reliability, the truthfulness of what you've been told? And yet the prosecution wants you to make the most important decision imaginable. A truly momentous decision, one that affects the life and freedom of my client. They want you to make a decision to find him guilty of the most terrible crime and to make that decision based upon completely unreliable evidence. And yet, as soon as I'm finished, ladies and gentlemen, the assistant prosecutor will tell you there is no reasonable doubt as to Mr. Allen's guilt. That's exactly what she's going to tell you. There's no reasonable doubt. That's not true. It's preposterous. It's absolutely ridiculous and absurd. There was no credible evidence presented in this entire case, and there certainly is nowhere near the kind of evidence necessary for a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's talk about that burden of proof. You've heard me argue strenuously, emphatically in fact, that the state's evidence cannot be trusted. You had a chance to listen to it, see it, and evaluate it the same way you would evaluate anything else in life, and I would submit that it's clear that this evidence was, at the very least, absolutely unreliable. But let's, just for argument's sake, ask ourselves, not whether the evidence is unreliable, but only whether it's reasonably possible that it's unreliable. Let me say that again. I want you to ask yourselves, is it reasonably possible that the evidence presented by the state is unreliable? Is it a reasonable possibility, that the man who walked away from that 2012 Audi was not my client? Well, if the answer, honestly, and it may seem absurdly obvious, if the answer is yes, of course, it's a reasonably possible that it's not him. Now remember, I'm not asking you whether you're certain of it. I'm not asking if you're firmly convinced of it. I'm not even asking if you think it's probably him. This is very important, ladies and gentlemen. I'm only asking if you believe there's a reasonable possibility that it's not him. A reasonable possibility that it's not him. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the most important question in this entire case. And I would ask you, ladies and gentlemen, when you go back into the jury room to ask yourselves, is there a reasonable possibility that the man walking on 7th Ave and 16th Street is not my client? That's such a critical question, because if the answer to that is yes, it's reasonably possible that it's not him, then that, ladies and gentlemen, is reasonable doubt. If it is reasonably possible that it's not my client, then you have a reasonable doubt. That's what reasonable doubt is. And then you must, don't take my word for it, the judge is going to tell you, you must find my client not guilty, if that's your answer. That alone, the existence of a reasonable possibility that it was not my client on that surveillance camera, means that the state has not met its high burden of proof, and the verdict must be not guilty. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a reason that burden is so high. But just as there is a desire for justice, we cannot dispense it if it means creating another injustice. The evidence shows that my client did not commit this crime. He should not be sacrificed because we want justice for someone else, because we want closure for a tragic case. My client's life has meaning too, and it shouldn't be destroyed simply because we understandably feel the need to do right by the victim. The standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. You must search for reasonable doubt, which, as I've said, could mean a reasonable possibility that it was not Mr. Allen on those videos. That alone constitutes reasonable doubt in this case, and a reasonable doubt requires a verdict of not guilty. Ladies and gentlemen, we all selected you because we had a sense about you, a belief that you would follow the law and carefully evaluate all of the evidence. And that's what I ask you to do. Review all of the evidence. Listen to each other. Hold these questions up to the light of your own common sense. Ask yourselves, is this the kind of evidence I can rely upon? Is this the kind of evidence I can trust in order to convict a man, an innocent man, of the most serious charges imaginable? Is there a reasonable possibility that it's not Mr. Allen? When you're done with that review, ladies and gentlemen, when you've held this weak evidence up to the light of common sense, I feel sure you will come back in here and give us a true verdict, one in which you simply say that the state has not met its burden, and it has not proved my client's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, They did not prove it. They didn't even come close to proving it. And I'm confident that you will find that the only truthful verdict here is one of not guilty. Thank you very much.